Spring Framework 6.2 is out. I mean, we're going to use Spring Boot 3.4, of course, but with it comes this new baseline Spring Framework 6.2. Now, bear in mind, this is a huge release, right? Spring Framework 6.2 is a major release. We didn't have a 6.1, 6 months ago. The last time we had a major release of Spring Framework was a year ago, right? So this is actually a year's worth of pent-up changes. There's a lot of cool stuff in here. Obviously, we've gotten minor upgrades along the way. It wasn't like it was just 6.1 a year ago and then 6.2 a week ago, right? It's been plenty of different incremental updates. Now, of course, if you're using Spring Boot, you probably didn't even notice, don't even care, right? It's fine because you're going to use Spring Boot upgrades for you. So as long as you're upgrading Spring Boot, the one little property, the one version, you're getting the latest and greatest. So what do we got here? Well, we've got an upgrade from Spring Framework 6.1. We've got the minimum baseline changes, requirements for changing for Spring Boot and Spring Framework itself. So if you're using GraalVM, you must use Hibernate 6.5 or later. Otherwise, Spring Framework 6.2 raises the baseline to 2.3.3 and for FreeMarker and HTML Unit 4.2. By the way, this is a different dependency. This is actually a different library. So they make extra care to call this out later. They support codecs for protobuf 4.x, raising our baseline, etc. And we've got a bunch of features in the core container, some of which you may or may not notice. We've got qualifiers, doing the right thing, and interacting with Jakarta and annotation priority. This is a slight change in the way these things are working. We've also got better generic type matching. So if an injection point that previously matched does not match anymore, double check your generic signatures at the injection site, e.g. your constructor argument. And for the bean type of the bean definition, e.g. the return type of the bean method. It's less lenient in accepting fallback matches now, insisting on resolvable part of the type signature to match, even if the remaining part is leniently accepted with unresolvable type variables or wildcards. You probably won't notice this, but if you do, now you know why, okay? Component scanning is no longer allowed on a auto configuration class that itself has, conditional on bean or something like that. Basically, this component scanning happens much earlier, and in order for Spring to have made this work before, it had to pull the evaluation of these auto configurations into an earlier phase when the component scanning was happening. But at this point, we really couldn't tell about the status of the beans in the context, so we're now just effectively disallowing that. Okay, we've got a much more vivid sort of disallowance of bean overriding. You can, but there's logs. Okay. Spring expression language has gotten optimized. We got a reflective property accessor. Nice, okay. Web applications have slightly different support for static resources. They now have a trailing slash appended if not present. This is because otherwise the path segment after the last slash is dropped when appending the request path with resource.create relative. WebJar's locator core no longer support. This is deprecated. This is because this did stuff at runtime, whereas now we can do a lot of stuff at compile time, and this depends upon an index that gets built, and it's called WebJar's Locator Lite. So this is what the new thing is, right? And actually, this is part of the WebJar's project, but it came about with the work of, among others, Sébastien Deleuze and Dr. David Sire on the Spring team. JMS support. There's a new property there for idle receives per task limit. The details are. Stomp over WebSocket now orders components. It declares it 0. Fine. Testing HTML unit, right? This is the note I just said above, migrating from HTML unit to 2 to 3.0. Okay. You can, so if you're using a value in certain places and you have property placeholder resolution, it's very hard to keep anything that looks like a property placeholder in the string if it's going to be evaluated, right? It'll get interpolated out of the template, and so now you can escape that expression. For example, if you want to have this string evaluated by something else besides Spring's property placeholder resolution, you can just say $$ as opposed to just $. Fallback beans. This is the mirror image of primary, right? So basically, if Spring is trying to inject a bean of a single type and you've got 3 that are viable candidates, or let's just say 2, and you want to make sure that something matches eventually, but only if nothing else will match, then you can specify a fallback, right? And the idea is that you might have beans that are, for whatever reason, either conditional or they're tied to a profile or whatever. So if nothing else is viable, then Spring will inject this one. You still have 2 different beans in the context, by the way. You're just helping Spring understand that when somebody injects a bean of this type, that this is the one it's supposed to use if none other are available, right? No other implementations of my service. There's background bean initialization, right? That now supports, background sort of async initialization. Nice. Enhanced Spring expression language, right? Talked about this a little bit, right? We have first class support for indexing into custom structures via the new index accessor. We have, in the Spring framework itself, we have 3 annotations that support mocking or swapping out implementations of beans that are used in the test in an invariant fashion from the application context in which they are normally defined. So you might recognize a mock bean in Spring Boot. Well, this is now in Spring Framework, so I guess you could use these instead, right? Okay, we have assert J style support for mock MVC, so you can create something called MVC tester, and then that works nicely with assert J, right? Here you go. We have the ability to register dynamic properties. So now there's like 3 different stories, one of which has been is being deprecated. So basically, you can create a bean that implements dynamic property registrar, in which case you'll be given a pointer to a thing to which you can contribute properties. This supersedes the static approach that we had before. Constructor binding for data into constructors. Okay, very nice. Data binding from headers. Okay. For you HTMX and Turbo enjoyers out there, fragment rendering has finally come. Okay, we'll talk about this in a bit. Content negotiation for exception handler methods now supports content negotiation during error handling. Fantastic. URL parsing. Okay, well, moving on. Easier reflection. I love this one. This is super good, right? If I want to have an application that that has a reflective type, and if it's a Spring Bean right now, then I can add @reflective to the Spring Bean, and that method on which the @reflective annotation exists will get registered for reflection in a GraalVM native image context. Remember that when you compile GraalVM native images, that the compilation requires that you be very explicit about where you do dynamic things. And so Spring has all these mechanisms to help you discover and then register this dynamic behavior. And we discover this stuff at compile time. Up until now, we've done that only for managed components, that is to say Spring Beans, right? But what this does is now you have this new thing called reflective scan, or reflection scan, that lets you scan arbitrary classes, any class on the class path, and as long as they have @reflective, you can now find DTOs and other things like that, and have them get registered for reflection as well. And of course, this doesn't cost anything extra but the whole point is that we're doing that scan once during compilation, and then that gets amortized away into a reified sort of super hyper-optimized build for your GraalVM compilation. A bunch of other small stuff, right? So you have like duration format and scheduled now support 30 seconds or 2 hours and 30 minutes as opposed to, cron or intervals or rates or whatever. Let's see. Server response now provides more ways to send data streams for WebMVC functional endpoints. Fine. The new chips feature deployed by browser vendors requires changes in applications using third-party cookies. So you can now use this new capability called chips. I don't know much about it, but I'm sure we'll learn about it at some point. Good. So okay, this is the 5,000 foot view of everything. Let's see what it looks like in practice. So I have a brand new application. I'm not going to look at every feature that we've just looked at, but I'm going to look at some. Okay. So the very first thing I'm going to look at is the fallback support. So suppose I have an interface called message provider, which is tasked with the arduous task of giving a message, and I'm going to use that here in this controller message provider. I want to provide an implementation of that, right? So the natural way is to just define a bean. So let's say I go here, put that here, actually put that up, and I can just cut this. So if I have just a single bean of type simple message provider, which in turn implements message provider, then of course the only one that Spring would inject in this case is that simple message provider, right? But what happens if I have a second one that I have marked as primary? Well, in this case, given that these are both implementations of message provider, Spring will pick the one that is marked as primary among the two. So here, I'm injecting only one instance, and so it's got to pick from among the two. If I had injected an array like that, then Spring wouldn't have to care. Or if I had asked Spring to give me a map like that, then Spring wouldn't have to care. It could just give me a reference to everything. But that's not what it's done here, right? I've got one instance. So Spring has to pick from among the two. Here I've said that this is the primary one, that if there's a choice, if there's a conflict, if there's any kind of contention, then always choose this. But what is the opposite of primary? Well, the opposite of primary is fallback. And so this is a default implementation. And this one will get activated if none other are available. So let's go ahead and try it out. Okay, so I'm going to go here and let's see. If we run this right now, we should get the primary, right? The primary is the sophisticated one, and the sophisticated one prints out this ASCII for an emoji with a top hat. Okay, so that's the primary one. Let's put that behind a profile. Okay, sophisticated. So now this won't get a chance to run. It's effectively commented out, right? Because I haven't activated the profile. So now I got the simple implementation. That's this one, right? So the fallback status kicks in, and so Spring says, well, you've got a implementation that doesn't have a primary annotation on it, but it's also not marked as a fallback. So if there's a contention between these two, fallback is always to be the last one. It's always going to choose this one first, right? And if I decide to, for whatever reason, put a profile on that one, simple, then, well, of course, the fallback gets injected, right? So we can now see default, right? That's the default no-op implementation. So fallback is the mirror image of primary. Convenient. Okay, let's roll that back. What else? So I've got the controller. It's injecting this message provider, the same one that we just looked at. I've got 3 different versions, but you know what? I'm not actually interested in testing those message providers. I'm interested in testing the functionality of this controller. So let's go ahead and write a test. And I've got this test here called Greetings Controller Test. I want to swap out the implementation of message provider. I want to make it an invariant because I'm not trying to test that. We already know, presumably, that because there's some other test, that this actually does the job of providing a message. So what I want to test is instead the interaction between a client and my HTTP service. And the way I can do that is by using this new test bean annotation. I have created a field of type message provider annotated with the test bean, and now I'm going to create a mock MVC tester here. This is using the AssertJ style, tester. I'm going to inject the web application context, right, in the constructor there. I'll create the mock MVC, and then then in order to tell Spring what to substitute this with, I'm going to create a message provider static method that returns a message provider that has the same name here. So Spring will delegate to this instead of the one that's in the context. Even though I've got 3 in the context, it's going to delegate to this one when injecting this particular message provider. And so if I then go to my code here and say, get the, call the endpoint, and by the way, this is me using the new AssertJ style endpoints here, right? I'm saying make a call to hello, accept the content as JSON and make the request. And then when I get the response, assert that the response contains this test message, which is what I'm hard coding as being the return value here. So let's go ahead and run this test. There we go. So we've got our our application. It's started up. We've got green test. So that's worked, right? And if I can prove it by just doing that, which will of course break the test because that's not the string that it's expecting. So there you go. So you can see it's actually returning. It's defaulting. It's deferring to that bean. I quite like this AssertJ style matcher thing, right? I'm actually saying match that this response has this content as a string and that it contains this message, right? This is a very nice thing. If you've used AssertJ, then you're probably used to having most of your code written in AssertJ, but then having to use the sort of non-AssertJ friendly mock MVC support that we've had in Spring for 10 years to 11 years. I quite like this. Really, really nice. Now, let's say I'm in my tests and I want to change something about the application context as the application starts up. This is common for all sorts of reasons. Maybe I want to change the port on which it's running, right? And by default, it's running on port 8080, but I want to inject a custom port, or maybe I want to put in some string to isolate something that I want to make sure is invariant or whatever, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to change the Spring Framework environment abstraction. The common canonical way is to use this @dynamic property source and then have a method here where you inject the dynamic property registry, right? And here you can contribute to the property, to the environment basically, a key and then a supplier with the value. So here in my test, I'm injecting the application context, I'm getting the Spring Framework environment, and I'm asserting that when I call dynamic.message.1 here, that the value I get back is equal to 1. Now 1 and 2 are just static strings I've got in this class here, okay? So this is the sort of existing approach that we would have done before. But I've got a new mechanism in Spring Framework that supports registering beans as part of my configuration during tests and having those register configuration. So I've imported some test configuration here. This is just a Spring Framework Java configuration class. It's in the source test folder here, and in it I've registered a bean of type dynamic property registrar, and I happen to create a static class, but you don't need to. You could just return a dynamic properties registrar inline. And here I'm registering same exact interface, by the way. I'm saying dynamic.message.to is 2, and again that is coming from this static string. So now when I go back to my test, I can confirm that 2 is equal to that, right? So let's run this test and see what that gets us. Nice. So again, both of these have they have the benefit of being evaluated long before the test has fully initialized the context. So it's in time for Spring Boot and other things that depend upon configuration to come along and see those values. So if you want to change, for example, server.port, if you want to change the data source URL or whatever, then this gets configured. And by the way, those properties then get bound to configuration properties object. So if I wanted to, I could actually create a configuration properties annotated Java bean and then create fields for 1 and 2 and then inject that configuration properties object here directly and assert the same kind of thing. 1 equals my object dot 1 versus my object dot 2. Okay, so I think this is a really nice sort of grouping of features. I mean, there's a lot of other amazing things in the testing support, but we don't have enough time to get into all of it. Let's move back to production. And here is, I think, a feature that has been something people have been asking for a long time. Now, many of you probably know Wim de Blauw's amazing Spring HTMX integration, and it provides a nice object, a nice set of parameter resolvers and so on, and argument resolvers for Spring MVC that let you work with HTMX library, the HTMX library. Now, HTMX, for those of you who don't know, HT is a JavaScript library that it's a JavaScript library that lets you decorate certain attributes on the page and in an HTML page and specify that those things should be refreshed on certain events. So basically, you work with HTML, you work with attributes. You don't write JavaScript against this library. This JavaScript library lets you stop writing JavaScript. And the point of this is that you've got a server, it can generate HTML. Why bother regenerating that HTML in JavaScript? Why not just have the server send down the fragment of HTML markup and then have this library, swap out islands of functionality on the HTML page that refer to the JavaScript that's being rendered on the server side. So this way, if I update something, I can automatically have it recreate or update in place a fragment of HTML on the page using this library. So I guess you really just need to see it, right? So let's go ahead. We've got this initializer. This initializer is a regular Spring Bean that injects something called the to-do repository. The to-do repository is just a Spring Data JDBC repository that manages entities of type to-do, whose primary key is of type integer, its ID and title. And the repository, the initializer, when it starts up, I delete all the existing to-dos, and I'm then writing 3 different to-dos. It's to-do 1 is write a new blog, to-do is record a live video on HTMX, and 3 is record a new podcast episode. And I'm just taking a string, splitting it by a comma. And then for each of those 3, I'm saving it off to the database, okay? Fine. So now we have a controller to manage this data in the database. So when somebody goes to the endpoint, /todos, we are, and this is not a REST endpoint, mind you, right? This is a regular Spring MVC controller. So when you go to /get mapping, it's returning the name of a view called todos. And on the class path here, I've made sure I'm using, this is another thing, I'm using WebJars here. This WebJars library allows me to manage via Maven or Gradle my JavaScript script tags, right? My JavaScript script assets. So here, this is on the class path, and Spring Boot, because it's using this new WebJars locator Lite, and it even manages it for us, because of that, it's serving up content from these jars directly from the jars, and I can reference them in my HTML page, right? And that HTML page is, by the way, is a time leaf template. So if I go to todos.html, you can see it's script source webjars htmx.org dist htmx.min.js. This doesn't actually exist. This is a virtual URL. When I put in this URL, Spring MVC serves up the static asset by delegating to the WebJars locator index, which is constant and pre-built, and then it resolves that to the script file that's in the jar. Now the script file, if I go here, you can see it's actually, you have a version in there. You have the actual script file itself. There's no path that looks exactly like this, right? And yet somehow it does work, right? I'm getting the resolved version of the script. And so this is a timeleaf template. You can see it says there's a timeleaf namespace in the HTML markup. Here's some CSS, that's fine. And let's go back and restore that, I guess. Okay, and we've got some islands of functionality. Here's the list. So using timeleaf on the server side, I'm saying for each to-do object in the model object in the attribute called to-dos, this is a fragment called to-dos. And for each one of those, render the ID, the title, and a button that you can click that allows you to delete something. And this is timeleaf. This attribute on the server side tells timeleaf to render an attribute on the tag called hxDelete that points to the fully qualified resolved URL with the parameter. So the URL is /todos/ID. The ID is, it's the ID of the object that we're evaluating here. And I'm sorry, this is the ID of the object that we're evaluating. This is a parameter in a URL, and we're resolving that parameter with this dictionary of keys and values. So ID equals the value from the model object on the server side, and that gets substituted in here. So it's a very, very confusing thing. So what we want to happen ultimately is hxDelete equals todos 5, right? What we have is a URL that looks like that, and we want something to come along and realize that it's this, and to replace the curly bracket, the path variable, if you will, with the resolved model object, which lives in this. So we've got so in order for that to work, and because there might be a servlet context, it might be, apps, whatever, we're doing a couple things all at once. We're using the timeleaf attribute and having it render the tag for me, so like that, right? That's part one. And obviously you need to escape it unless you're using the special syntax that I was using. So that's part one. It's going to render that for me, and it's going to prefix this with the right context path if required. That's what the at curly bracket is. But then we also want to do the substitution of this, so we also have this secondary parenthesis ID equals blah. Okay, it's a lot of things happening at once. But the result is that you get this attribute called hxDelete that gets written out in the markup on the client in the browser. These are all actual, markup attributes that get rendered in the server side as well, and these are for HTMX. So when you click this button, HTMX says, it pops up a dialog saying, "Are you sure?" And if you say yes, then it targets the closest .todo element. So it does a swap on the closest .todo. Well, of course, this is a to-do element, right? We're inside of the to-do element. We're going to swap the outer HTML. So, everything, including the tag. The class for the button, okay, fine. And then what we want to happen here is a trigger, is a click attribute. So notice I'm not writing in JavaScript, right? So now what does that look like on the server side? If I go here, this is the delete button, right? So what happens on the server side? So if I go to the server side, I've got a delete mapping /todo ID, returning with some HTML, and really I'm returning HTML directly, as opposed to this is like a REST endpoint. I'm returning a string, not the name of a view, because there's nothing to render, right? I could return a view, but there's nothing to render. I just want to delete the code, delete the object in the database, and then return quote quote. And what that'll do is it'll have the effect of deleting the row from the table, because it'll just be an empty string when the JavaScript comes back, when the HTML comes back over AJAX, over the DHTML. And what else do we have here? We have the form. So again, here's a button. I'm going to click on this to add something. It's going to include new to do, right? That's where's new to do? Let's look at that. Oh, it's this right here. So here's this. It's going to include this text in the request. It's going to go to the to-dos endpoint, and the target will be to-dos list. I'm going to swap out this over here, right? To-dos list. So I'm going to swap out an adjacent island of functionality, and it's going to happen based on a click. Okay, and of course here's reset, and all that does is it publishes an event over here. Where's my reset? There you go. It publishes an event that re-renders the entire to-dos thing. So what's interesting? Well, if you go back to the add functionality here, you can tell we're going to update both this page, this column, this fragment, this island, and we're going to update this, right? So we want to reset the form so that there's nothing in it because again, it's been saved to the database. We're not editing it, we're just adding it. So this will update this island and include just the default HTML text inputs. And then we want to update this island to include the new row. Okay, so we have two different fragments of functionality that we want to come back. And we've identified them by saying th fragment to-dos form and th fragment equals to-dos, all right? So when we go back to the controller and we look on the add endpoint, you can see something a little different now. We are returning a collection of model and views. So we're saying save the to-do based on the information coming from the request. This is the attribute in the input element. We're adding an attribute to the model called to-dos, pointing to the new list of to-do objects. And then we're returning two, not one, but two, a collection of model and views. And the model and views are timeleaf style or timeleaf compatible, template name, fragment name, template name, fragment name. So if you look at the markup that comes back on the server side when you do this, we're not sending the whole page. We're not sending the header tag and the title and all that stuff. We're just sending those two fragments back. And then HTMX is smart enough to know to, slurp or find or identify the DOM nodes for the elements that we're trying to swap out from the AJAX response and then to automatically replace the ones in the page in situ. So let's go see it in action. Localhost, to-dos. All right, so I've got these three elements, okay? I'm gonna load up the developer tools there, refresh. Okay, you can see this is just, the first page is just a regular page. I'm just loading it. Notice that we have the delete, right? To-dos 2, hx delete, to-dos 3, etc. So that's being resolved. That's the weird substitution with the th attribute stuff that we saw earlier. And otherwise, it's just regular HTML, nothing special per se. Let's go ahead and delete something, asking, am I sure? You better believe it, I am, okay? And when I do that, now we can see I've just got this. The headers, it shows I had a delete call to to-dos 3, and I got back, basically a string, empty string, and so on. So that's working just fine. Let's go ahead and add something. Update the list. Okay, I hit add. It's showing up there now instantly, and here's the response that we got back from the server side. The two different fragments, right? So the fragment for to-do line, and then here's another fragment, to-dos form, right? And it's automatically updated the form and this is the form down here, and it's updated the list of to-dos seamlessly. I didn't have to do anything. You didn't see me writing in JavaScript to do that. It didn't happen. I didn't do a full refresh. Now, of course, if I do a full refresh, well, everything shows up exactly as it did just a second ago, right? Because the thing I get from a full reload versus the thing I have in HTML based on the DOM state is all the same. It's all coming from the same exact template on the server side. Isn't that nice? Very, very convenient. So if you want, I wouldn't set out to build the next Gmail with this. I don't think that's going to be very fun. But if you want to build something a little bit dynamic and just be on the way very, very quickly and not have to write a line of JavaScript, this is a really, really convenient way to go, and it's supported out of the box now. There are still some use cases for which obviously Wim de Blauw's amazing library is perhaps better suited, but for common case stuff, I think this might be enough. I don't know. All right, so this has just been a very quick look at some of the amazing features in Spring Framework 6.2. I hope you got something out of it. Enjoy your journey to production. Keep in mind, this is a new release of Spring Framework. You can see there's a support page there. So now, if you're on 6.1, which came out in 2023 in November, a year ago, or if you're on 6.2, which came out this month, just a week and some change ago, a little bit more than a week ago, then you are supported. But if you're on 6.0, you're no longer in open source support, right? Remember that. So please upgrade. Upgrade ideally to 6.2, but if you need to, then 6.1, okay? It's always good to keep ahead. You've got a whole year in which to sort of make sure you're keeping up with the latest and greatest. All right, this has been a very quick look at some of the amazing features in Spring Framework 6.2 as included in Spring Boot 3.4. We're on a journey now. I'm not sure what the future holds for the 6.x line, but remember, next year we have Spring Framework 7 and Spring Boot 4. So it's especially important to get up to 6.2 at least and pay attention to the deprecations, where and if they occur. You want to make sure that these things don't get deleted a whole cloth before you're ready for them, right? Because that'll make the move to 7.0 harder still.